We continue here. 2021 Nobel Literature laureate, that's Abdul-razak Gurnah, has delivered the 22nd Nelson Mandela Lecture at the Wits University this afternoon. The Tanzanian-born Gurnah is a former professor of English at the University of Kent. His body of work includes A Paradise by the Sea and Memory of Departure. Let's go now to my colleague Iman Rappetti, who's now at Wits University, to give us more on what the speech was about. Iman, it would seem that Professor Gurnah's speech touched a lot on humanity. Talk us through those events that played out early on.
Ntlanta, thank you. And what a gorgeous afternoon of dialogue it was, and hearing the perspectives of the keynote addressee this afternoon, which is Professor Abdul-razak Gurnah, Nobel Prize winner in the field of literature, and a lot of sentiments shared which converge with the topic of this year's lecture, which is our shared humanity. And I want to welcome you to our little makeshift studio here at the Wits Linda Auditorium. It was a really great afternoon hearing you speak, and I want to go back to something you said in another interview around the importance of storytelling and hearing the stories of others and being able, through that device, to be able to tell your own.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me here. Hearing stories are ways of understanding the world in a way. You know, when people tell stories, I don't mean tell, what happened here, what happened there. When they tell a story, what they're really doing is giving you their worldview, how they see the world. So listening to people talking like that about themselves or about where they are, about how they see what's going on elsewhere, tells you how they see things around them. And so you understand how to imagine other things about them, even if they haven't talked about those things as well. So yeah, I think stories are both important to us, ourselves, as we tell them. Self-expression, we see this is how I see things, this is what I found memorable, this is what I found funny, but also to a listener. They tell you more than the storyteller thinks they're telling.
And it's so fascinating because you started off attuning your ear at the hearth of your aunties and the women in the home. You lived in an extended family growing up.
Yeah, well, sure. But in fact, most kids do end up, at least in the way we grew up or our time, most kids grow up around the women, as it were. The men usually are off somewhere else, either earning a living or just messing about in a cafe somewhere. And so when children spend a lot of time, boys and girls, with their mothers and their aunts and their grandmothers and so on. And anyway, they're better storytellers on the whole.
Yeah. And that's a beautiful story, and I really do encourage our viewers to go and read some of your literature and the books that you've written. I want to come closer to this topic of our shared humanity. And one of the things that was so stark in hearing you speak today was the concept of what is shared and whether we all have the same experience of the same thing. And the recognition that our experiences are different from each other is really important in how we build bridges across to each other.
Yes, we have to understand. Otherwise, you end up really simplifying both the story of people's lives, but also if you're addressing a problem, you end up simplifying the problem because you want to see that everybody is actually facing the same issues. But without detail, or historical detail. I mean, there is nowhere in the world that has had the very specific experience of South Africa, of apartheid. I mean, there are other forms of discrimination and so on, but not something as brutal as that machinery that existed for however long, 1948 to 1994. So you can't just assume that everywhere else where there is a form of state discrimination is the same as apartheid. But nonetheless, you see overlaps. You see how there are certain shared experiences. But you have to also concede and understand the specifics. Otherwise, you don't understand that problem or even your own problem.
One of the things that was so stark about what you said was you said ordinary people know what's going on. Well, ordinary people, who are relatively well informed, they know what's going on. And we look at things, for example, in the Sahel region where we see coups d'etat taking place. We see the will of young people being expressed in a very different way, a definition of democracy that might be different to them. We see some of that agitation here in South Africa as well, where the boon of democracy hasn't been delivered, particularly when it comes to economic freedom. How important is it to listen to voices that don't always speak with a common voice, that sometimes seem to be on the periphery?
Yeah, sure. It helps probably to understand your own problem if you can see, that's what I said about shared experience, if you can see what's going on elsewhere. You don't say, because that's what they're doing there, we should do the same thing, because circumstances are different. And they're responding, I mentioned the example of Kenya, and the way recently, a few months ago, now it must be 3 or 4 months, the young people kind of spontaneously, obviously there must have been some organization, but almost spontaneously, came out in the streets to protest endlessly for several days, and the police just shot them down. Now, this is not a unique experience in African countries. People get shot down for protesting in this way. So what do? You learn from that there is a certain kind of limit at which you must retreat. Otherwise, your life will be taken.
What would you say is the cautionary tale in that example for South Africa?
You learn, I mean, I know South Africa has had many experiences like that, of people being gunned down by state authorities, both in the before 1994 and post-1994. So it's not an unknown thing that the state, or at least the state, shall we say, arms, the state bodies, as it were, intervene violently at times. And what you learn is, I guess, caution. You still protest, but you have to learn how to do so without putting your life at risk.
As you look across the continent, South Africa included, as you say, don't ask me to predict the future, and we can respect that, but to lean into your expertise and your observations, to tap into some of the stories and the tapestries of experiences that you've connected with. What are some of the warning signs for us on the African continent as we mull and define our own future?
I always think that the two things that we must get right are schools, educating children, and hospitals to look after us, ourselves, and our elders, and so on. Because you cannot be a civil society when children cannot go to school, cannot be educated, cannot learn how to live in the world that they're living in, and when people who are ill cannot be looked after. So I think what I would say is that we're making progress in many places, but there are so many other matters. You can say the obvious things. So much of the resources of the nation get stolen one way or another. Self-interest overrides these other responsibilities that governments and those who own the government should have. So I say, so long as our schools are not working, and so long as our hospitals are not working, we are not working.
And, you know, is that a potential time bomb that we're sitting in South Africa here in the South, where we think we've got our stuff pretty much together because we have democratic elections, we respect the outcomes, the leaders respect the outcomes, we just now have a government of national unity. You know, some say it is working. Do we have blind spots in this?
Listen, I told you I don't predict the future. You've got to work it out for yourselves. But there are warning signs. Warning signs, I don't think it looks, to me, South Africa doesn't look as bad as you South Africans think. There are other places where are actually in a much, much worse state. And there, so many of the things that you take for granted. I know there's an unemployment problem, and I know there's still great poverty, and that is so in many, many other places as well. It's the struggle. Everybody, I think, is heading in the right direction. It's just the way that the resources of the nation keep somehow getting frittered away in frivolities or in corruption, to use that dirty word.
What's the next step for you? You've written prolifically, you've won all of these awards, you're really respected in not only the field of literature, but also in academia and in education.
Just keep doing it.
Okay.
Keep doing what I've been doing, so long as I can.
And especially because you've been doing it especially well. Thank you,
That's
Prof.
very
Gurnah.
kind of you.
Appreciate your time today, and thank you very much for being with us. Professor Abdul-razak Gurnah, who delivered the keynote address and the 2024 annual lecture here at the Wits Linda Auditorium. And with that, it's back to you in studio in Tlantla.
Thank you so much. That's my colleague Iman Rappetti catching up with Professor Gurnah there.